The COVID pandemic has prompted us to rethink many aspects of our daily lives, including the education of our children. And our next guest has been studying the growth over the past couple of years of something called microschooling. Andy Smarick is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and he joins us now to share some of his knowledge about this topic. Thanks for talking to us.
Well, it's a treat to be here. Thanks for having me.
So before we get into what you've learned about it, tell us, what is microschooling and how might it be distinguished from something like learning pods or other new innovations we've heard about recently?
Well, definitions are a little bit of a problem when it comes to this area in a way that we didn't have to really worry about 5, 10, certainly 20 years ago. First, let me talk about microschooling and then try to broaden it to include some of these other categories because in truth, they're very similar. And honestly, parents don't care so much about category names like researchers do. So the overlap turns out to be more important for people doing analysis than people living the life of these things. So in short, the quick idea is that a micro school, we used to say that it was a handful of students or less than 10. The definition has gotten a bit more flexible, but the idea is it is a very, very small learning environment, typically in the private school sector, with no more than maybe a dozen or a couple dozen kids. You could get by saying there's a micro school with 30 or 40 kids, but once it starts to get up that high, it turns into something much more traditional. So a very small learning environment, typically in the private school sector, with a great deal in common with homeschooling. And then the only difference with pods or hubs, a pod is typically supplementary or complementary to a traditional learning environment. So kids will go to a traditional public school and then be involved in a pod after school or on the weekends. Whereas the idea of a micro school is it is the primary learning environment for a student. And then a hub is generally thought of as a space, more of a physical location where different students who are maybe taking different online courses from different providers, maybe involved in a homeschool or a pod or a hub kind of program, all locate together. But what makes a micro school different is it's a small learning environment and it's the primary place where that set of students are getting their education.
You and your colleagues at the Manhattan Institute have looked at microschooling in several different states, a very interesting group of states. You looked at Idaho, New York, and Arizona. Why did you decide to look at the schools there?
Well, we knew that we couldn't do every state, and we started thinking about how can we triangulate, get as close a view to what is actually happening out in the field as possible by doing a limited number of places. And a couple things were on our mind. We wanted to do some big states, some small states, some mostly rural, some mostly urban, some with large suburban areas, but then also states that had different policies related to private schools and homeschooling. So for example, Idaho has a very flexible homeschool set of policies at the state level. New York is more stringent. Some people would say the regulations are too tight. Arizona, some people think it's generally the Wild West of education policy. So by learning from these different places, we could see some of the differences, but also a great deal of the commonalities that we would see across America.
Speaking of the commonalities, looking at these three states and giving them sort of a deep dive, what were some of the common themes that you found about microschooling?
Two really pop out. One is that microschooling existed prior to the pandemic, and it just reflects something that is part of the American spirit. It's related to homeschooling, but it goes back even further, that there are just some people who want small learning environments. They want to be really in charge of their kids' education, and they're willing to kind of go it on their own, so they don't need a traditional public school or a private school. 100 years ago, it was no big deal to talk about a one-room schoolhouse and expect there might be kids of different grade spans learning together, or there might only be a dozen or so kids learning in a geographic area. And that might represent an entire school district. Because of consolidation, we have a whole lot less of that. But this is part of America's history and tradition, small learning environments for some kids. And then the second commonality is that, man, COVID changed things for 50 million students. When it hit, I guess it's March of 2019 that most people think that that's when the real eruption, the real change in schooling happened. millions of families decided that they needed to take charge of their education. Their schools were closed, or they were getting online services that weren't working for their students all that well. And so a lot of families started to experiment, and a non-trivial percentage of that 50 million decided they wanted pods or hubs or micro schools, not just traditional private or public schooling, and not always just traditional online learning that they could have gotten through some other means. They wanted this blend of different types of what we call modalities.
Okay, this sounds like an interesting idea. Do we have any sense at this point about how well it works?
The short answer is not in the quantitative empirical way that we would have from a number of other education enterprises out there. We have accountability systems in the traditional public school sector. So that means standardized tests and disaggregated results. So that goes back decades, and we can assess that. Most private schools do some kind of standardized testing. There are other ways of assessing that use less formal assessments, just ways of trying to get a handle on student learning. And then academics, of course, use a number of different ways of trying to figure out which students are learning what, and they have their own kind of methods that can be more sophisticated than just a standardized test. The problem with microschooling is not only is it new, the definitions of what it is and what it's not are still in doubt, still being questioned, still being worked out. But maybe even more than that is this is often a private school setting, often more like a homeschool setting, and families often get involved in this because they don't want this the big architecture of accountability systems and these test scores and test prep. So no, we don't have a whole lot of empirical data that we would use to assess other kinds of education delivery systems. But what we know is if we trust markets, if we trust parental demand and where parents are moving, the fact that it has grown, like for example, it doubled pretty much from pre-pandemic to maybe 6 months into the pandemic, microschooling in Arizona. We know that a lot of families gravitated towards it, and given that parents are largely in control of what's happening in micro schools, they can mold it to their preferences. So if students are liking it and families are liking that, tells us something, but we just do not have the data, at least not yet, to say reading scores are X percentage higher or math scores are X percentage lower. That just doesn't happen yet.
So now that you've had the study in the 3 different states and have had a chance to look at those various studies and the common themes, what do you see as the implications for the future of microschooling?
Well, it feels now like the pandemic, if it's not over, it's reaching its conclusion. And so all of the forces that pushed families to try something new, to create something new, like pods and hubs, online learning opportunities, and micro schools, a lot of that energy is going away. And what we're seeing, at least in survey data so far, is that most families, although they're interested in these kinds of novel experiments or attempts at education, that was spiking in 2019, 2020. A lot of parents are feeling more comfortable going back to what they knew and what they had, because it can be hard to run your own school. It can be tough to give up the job that you have and try to get 5, 10, 15 students together and run their education. So the most interesting part of this, the question that we don't have an answer to yet, is the fact that hundreds of thousands of students were doing this at its peak. Does it stay that way? Does it grow continue along its trajectory, or does it level off or even go backward now that families are feeling comfortable going back to what they had? We don't know yet. My hypothesis is we probably won't see the kind of exponential growth that we saw before. But having said that, in survey after survey, even right before the pandemic, but then after the pandemic, most families in surveys were saying they wanted to come out of the pandemic with education looking different than it looked beforehand. So they just didn't want to get through this period. They wanted to look at this as a pivot point. So maybe they go back to their traditional public school or traditional private school, but it is on their minds that they got to do something different. And if we take them at their word that in the long haul they want something different, maybe this continues to grow. Maybe it won't get up to, say, 3 or 4 or 5 million students like chartering has gotten up to at this point, or maybe it doesn't get up to 10% of the market like private schools has, but maybe it turns into 1 million students or 2 million students. And then we're talking about a significant part of the K-12 education landscape.
So if people want to learn more about the Manhattan Institute's work on micro schools, I assume they go to the website, search for your report?
They can do that. We have a dedicated page that has my summary report and the 3 reports that came before that, and then a series of other op-eds that we've done to try to promote it.
Andy Smarick is Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. And once again, we've been talking about microschooling and its growth, especially during the course of the pandemic. Andy, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you for having me.